Racing is a staple genre in the gaming industry, and it isn't going anywhere anytime soon. However, instead of looking into the future, we are going to take it way back. In this video, we are going to be exploring the history of the Test Drive series and how it helped shape racing into what it is today. This story begins in 1987 with the first entry into the series, titled Test Drive. It was published by Accolade, a game publisher that we will be mentioning a lot throughout this video. Test Drive allowed the player to choose one of 5 supercars: a Lamborghini Countach, Lotus Esprit Turbo, Chevy Corvette C4, Porsche 911 Turbo, or a Ferrari Testarossa, which the player could drive on a winding cliffside 2-lane road. The player was tasked with avoiding traffic and outrunning police traps. The game was divided into 5 stages, separated by gas stations that acted as pit stops. The game was considered to be a commercial success, with sales surpassing 250,000 copies. With this success, a sequel was developed called The Duel, Test Drive 2. They made great efforts to make a game that was better than the original. It featured similar vehicles, although they were faster and newer. The player now had the option to pick between automatic or manual transmission. There were also a number of difficulty options and multiple different levels to race on. The overall feeling of this game was much more fluid and smooth compared to the original. Both the first and the second game were developed by Distinctive Software and were published by Accolade. After the release of the second game, Accolade sued Distinctive for using certain systems from Test Drive 2 in a MS-DOS port of the game Outrun. Accolade argued that they owned those systems because they had hired Distinctive to make the game. Therefore, all systems used within the game were theirs. Once in court, Accolade lost, and in return severed their relationship with Distinctive. This game was also considered a commercial success, selling over 250,000 copies. In 1990, Accolade released Test Drive 3: The Passion. This was the first 3D test drive game. Although the graphics aren't by any means up to today's standards, it is impressive to see such progression within only 3 years. This game also featured simple physics and an overall brand new feel to a test drive game. The base game featured 3 drivable cars: the Lamborghini Diablo, Ferrari Mythos Pininfarina concept, and the Chevy Corvette Serve 3 concept. Later, an add-on package was released that included a New England road course and 2 new cars: the Acura NSX and the Dodge Stealth RT Turbo. This game also featured some pretty cool features like interchangeable radio stations, usable windshield wipers, headlights, and there were even varying weather conditions and times of day. But one feature trumps the rest. The developers made an instant replay screen that allowed you to watch yourself drive around in third person. You could even control the camera to get specific angles. However, not everything in this game was awesome. The steering kinda sucked. It was extremely sensitive, making the game harder to play than other entries in this series. But to be honest, I still enjoyed playing it even with the sensitive steering. This was the first Test Drive game to be developed by Accolade themselves. I think Accolade came off better after the lawsuit because it pushed them out of their comfort zone. The next entry into the Test Drive series wasn't until 1997. This new game was titled Test Drive OffRoad, and it was developed by Elite Systems. This game was the first Test Drive to feature third-person driving, as well as a mini-map. This game really wasn't like the others. It was more focused on racing. The first 3 are best described as drive until you crash, compared to this new version that was based on a traditional racing style. Your position in the race determined whether or not you won. It was released for MS-DOS and PlayStation and featured a couple of different modes: Practice Race, Mixed League, and Class League. The player had a selection of 4 off-road vehicles to choose from: a Hummer, a Jeep, a Land Rover, and a Chevy pickup truck. This game also featured a split-screen multiplayer, which was the first for the series. Although this game was different, it was welcome to the series. Within the first year, the game sold over 500,000 copies, although it didn't have the highest of ratings. In this same year, Accolade released Test Drive 4, developed by Pitbull Syndicate. This game was a lot closer to the original Test Drives, but still different enough that it could be called its own. Much like Test Drive Off-Road, this game featured much better driving physics and true 3D graphics. Still not even close to what we have today, but it is closer to what I think of when someone mentions an older racing game. The goal of this game was to race against AI racers in a street race. The game's tracks are long courses with rural roads and urban streets, and commonly featured traffic and short corners. Unlike any other game mentioned before in the Test Drive franchise, Test Drive 4 featured 14 different vehicles to choose from. Rather than rattling them off, I'm just going to display them on the screen for you. The tracks in this game were realistically modeled after real-world locations like Kyoto, Japan, and Washington, D.C. It is said that Accolade spent around $2 million on a promotional campaign for this game. The game's ads were featured on ESPN, Speed Vision, and MTV. There were even radio advertisements on the Howard Stern Show. During an interview with the VP of Accolade at the time, he said that they expected their game to be the best-selling game for the winter season. He He was right. All of this would pay off, as they expected, with the game reaching 850,000 copies sold by March of 1987. Because of the success, the PlayStation version was published under the Greatest Hits label by PlayStation. With the success of Test Drive Off-Road and Test Drive 4, it pushed the Test Drive franchise to new heights, even briefly being the best-selling racing franchise. Accolade went right back to work and hired Pitbull Syndicate to create two new games for 1998, Test Drive 5 and Test Drive 4x4, which was titled Test Drive Off-Road 2 in North America. I'm going to first talk about Test Drive 4x4 because it was released 7 days before Test Drive 5. There seems to be a bump in graphics compared to the first Test Drive Off-Road, and of course, new levels, but other than that, I didn't really see any huge changes. The game was released for PlayStation and PC, and it overall received mixed reviews. Let's move on to Test Drive 5. I'm really getting tired of saying Test Drive. Test Drive 5 was pretty similar to Test Drive 4. The game had improved graphics and better vehicle handling. It also featured new tracks from around the world, as well as some new vehicles. Other than that, just like Test Drive Off-Road 2, there really isn't a huge change, although it was received fairly well. Some reviewers mentioned that it was a rental game at best because the game is unbalanced and offers cheap AI. Another review stated, while this game is a decent arcade racer with great graphics, plenty of cars and tons of tracks, it simply falls short of its #1 competitor, EA's Need for Speed 3, in almost every conceivable way. Accolade spent $3 million on marketing for this pair of games. Doing research to this video, I came across this ad for the game. I think it's a perfect representation of the era and what they were really going for. Here, just watch this.
Alright, Eddie, gotta take you in this time.
I thought I smelled bacon.
Oh, nice. 72 in the school zone.
Hey!
I was doing 90.
Oh, butt tracks. Poor guy. Never saw you coming.
Alright, Eddie, let's go.
Test Drive 5. You have the right to remain reckless.
Bye, honey. Sorry about our date.
And unfortunately, that was the last test drive Accolade would ever make. Well, kind of. Infogrames, a publisher based in France, made a deal to acquire Accolade in 1999. Infogrames reportedly paid $50 million to acquire Accolade's workforce, their game franchises, including Test Drive and Hardball, and Accolade's licensing deals with brands. Infogrames did all of this as a strategy to gain a distribution network in North America. Shortly after, Infogrames released Test Drive 6, developed by Pitbull Syndicate and Centera, and Test Drive Off-Road 3, being developed by Infogrames and Centera. Test Drive 6 seemed to have large improvements on graphics and overall handling. It featured 37 licensed cars, as well as 4 police car variants. This was a first for the series. Also, another first, the cars licensed by GM weren't playable. Rather, they only appeared in traffic and were driven by AI. The game was developed for PlayStation, Game Boy, Windows, and Dreamcast. Overall, the game was pretty well received. All of this was pretty much the same for Test Drive Off-Road 3, otherwise known as Test Drive 4x4 World Trophy. It featured new graphics and an overall better feel, although personally I think the gameplay was rather dull. I'm not the only one that thinks this either. The game received rather poor reviews. This game was released for PlayStation, Game Boy Color, and Windows. There was also a Dreamcast version that was planned but was ultimately cancelled due to release issues. We have now reached the year 2000, which was a very busy year for the Test Drive franchise. There were a total of 4 games released and 1 that was cancelled. We're first going to start with Test Drive Le Mans. This was the first time Test Drive took the approach of a true racing game. The game was completely based on the real Le Mans race, as you probably guessed. The game had 4 different modes, including Le Mans 24-hour, arcade, championship, and multiplayer. You could even race for the entire 24 hours and basically simulate the race. The game feels great to play, with pretty modern feeling physics. Unlike most of the other Test Drive games, Test Drive Le Mans had 40 real race cars within the classifications from the real race. There were also multiple tracks included in the game: the Bugatti circuit, BMO circuit, and Suzuki circuit, just to name a couple. Also, to make the game even better, it featured a realistic weather and day and night system. The player's main task was racing, but over time the race would affect the car, causing it to overheat, lose fuel, and wear the tires. You were forced to pit and fuel up, change your tires, and overall manage your car. I think this game does a great job of being an early sim racing game. This game was released for PlayStation, Game Boy Color, Dreamcast, and Windows. It was also later ported to PlayStation 2. The game received relatively good reviews. After this game is where things start to get a little confusing from the corporate/development side. The next game from 2000 is called Test Drive V Rally, or at least that's what it was called on Dreamcast. On PlayStation, it was called Need for Speed V Rally 2, and on PC, it was just called V Rally 2. I know, it's confusing, but before we get lost in the vines of the game published publishing and development jungle, let's focus on the test drive version. The game features rally cars that competed in the 1999 World Rally Championship season. There are 26 cars in Championship Edition and 27 in Expert Edition. There are over 80 original tracks which represent all the rallies of the 1999 season, excluding Greece and Safari. The game modes included a time trial mode and an arcade mode, which follows traditional style of arcade games, and the championship mode, which follows actual example of rallying in different stages in the rallies featured in the game. V-Rally Trophy and Championship mode feature 3 distinct championships: European, World, and Expert. The game looked pretty good, and the handling overall felt nice while playing. It was released for PlayStation, Dreamcast, and Windows. There was also a planned Nintendo 64 version, but it was cancelled during the early development phases. The game received high reviews, with one reviewer calling it a colorful, fun, and realistic driving sim. The next entry on our list was Michelin Rally Masters, Race of Champions. You must be wondering why there is a non-test drive game on our list. Well, this is kind of similar to the previous game. Infogrames was really blurring the lines on the series and just using the name wherever it pleased. They wanted to port Michelin Rally to the Nintendo 64, however, it was cancelled. And that pushes us to the next game, Test Drive Cycles, developed by Centera. The game was a little different than the others. Instead of cars, it was based on motorcycles. It featured 24 tracks based on 12 real-world locations. There were 35 licensed motorcycles, with multiple upgrades and color options. The game was released only for the Game Boy Color. There were versions developed for PlayStation, Dreamcast, and Windows, however they were cancelled. Next up was another game that was only developed for Game Boy Color, Test Drive 2001. It was also developed by Centera. There isn't too much information on this game, but I did find that it was basically a sequel to the Game Boy version of Test Drive 6, and it was also the last test drive game that was ever developed for the Game Boy. It received pretty good reviews, but nothing extraordinary. All of those games were released in the year 2000. They were really trying to push the test drive name during this time. After 2000, things really started to slow down for the franchise, and the next game was released in 2001 called Test Drive Off-Road Wide Open. It was developed by Angel Studios, which was a first for the series. The game, much like the previous version of Test Drive Off-Road, consisted of off-road racing and featured 16 different vehicles from brands such as Chevy, Ford, Hummer, and Jeep. There was also a Mercedes-Benz ML430, which doesn't really strike me as an off-road vehicle, but whatever. The game seemed to lack the finesse that some of the others had, mainly with the physics. Some of the test drive games had pretty good physics, for the times at least. However, this game felt like you were glued to the ground when turning. Other than that, the game was pretty much the same as the others, but with improved graphics. This game was released for PlayStation 2 and Xbox. The reviews were pretty good, yet this would be the last test drive off-road game released. Next up was TD Overdrive, the Brotherhood of Speed, developed by Pitbull Syndicate. This was the last title that Pitbull Syndicate would develop for the series. This is also the first title in the series to show off an Atari logo. In 2001, Infogrames purchased Hasbro Interactive, which owned Atari. Thus, Infogrames became the owner of Atari and slowly rebranded their business to Atari SA. But let's get back to TD Overdrive. The game was focused on illegal street racing, somewhat similar to earlier entries in the franchise. The game featured tracks from San Francisco, Tokyo, London, and Monte Carlo. Fun fact, you could also play Pong while the game was loading. Now, that's innovation if you ask me. As for the cars, there was 23 licensed vehicles and a few customized versions as well. This was also the first game in the series to feature a story along with the arcade mode. Players assume the role as Dennis Black, a San Franciscan street racer. Black races in an exclusive street racing club on the behalf of another driver named Donald Clark, who had been injured in a race against Vasily, and I don't know how to say his last name, it's up on screen now, I have no idea how to say it, who is one of the club's most feared drivers. As Black's victories start to amount, he hears rumors from other drivers that Clark is simply using him to beat Vasily and win his prized Dodge Viper. After Black wins against Vasily, the rumors are proven true, as Clark admits to Black that he had been using him to obtain the Viper. Black then challenges Clark for everything that he has gained over his career, including the Viper. After a series of races set across all 4 cities, Black wins and Clark surrenders his Viper. The game was released for PS2 and Xbox, and it received pretty good reviews. After this, the next game was Test Drive Eve of Destruction, developed by Monster Games. Unlike any other test drive game, this game was based on Demolition Derby-like races. If you have ever played Wreckfest, this game is kind of similar to that. The physics and the feel of the overall game felt pretty good for dirt racing. The AI also did a good job of making the game challenging, which is something that other test drive games seem to struggle with. The game consisted of 4 different series of racing: compact, midsize, muscle, and special. In total, there were 32 different vehicles drivable in this game. This game was released for PS2 and Xbox, and the reviews were pretty on point with the last few games. The next game that came out was called Test Drive Unlimited, otherwise known as TDU. It was developed by Eden Games, which was owned by Infogrames, or known at this time as Atari SA. The game was unique, and not only for the franchise, but overall the racing industry. Well, kind of. TDU was an open world racing game, very similar to Forza Horizon or The Crew, even being cited as possibly possibly inspiring elements of these massive games. Unlimited serves as a reboot to the franchise, disregarding the continuity of the previous games. The game features over 125 licensed sports cars and motorcycles, and the terrain is modeled after the Hawaiian island of Oahu that features some 1,000 miles of roads and highways. In the online world of Test Drive Unlimited, players are able to drive both on-road and off-road in free roam mode, challenging other players to race in real time anywhere on the drivable map. It is also possible to drive on small islands outside of the main island. The roads are modeled after satellite images of the island. There is a spectrum of terrains, including rainforest, mountains, sandy beaches, and urbanized areas, including the city of Honolulu. It is worth noting, however, that other built-up areas on the island are not represented. The game begins by purchasing a car and a house. The player is then free to explore the island. As this happens, key locations on the map are revealed. These include car and bike dealerships, car rental agencies, tuning shops, paint shops, time challenges, courier, vehicle transportation, hitchhikers, and more. Success of the challenges are rewarded with in-game currency that are used to buy new vehicles and houses. This game was released for PS2, PSP, Xbox 360, and Windows. The game received high reviews and gained somewhat of a cult following. With the success of TDU, a sequel was released called TDU 2, also developed by Eden Games. TDU 2 is one of my favorite games of all time. This game was set on two islands, Oahu from the first version of the game, and Ibiza. The goal of this game was to obtain different racing licenses and compete championships to gain money and fame. The game starts the player out as a poor valet driver working in Ibiza and is forced into racing. The player's job is to build a career in racing and leave the poor life behind. This game also featured a casino where you could win or lose big. Most of the features from the original were improved upon and added to the sequel as well. The game was released for PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and Windows. Somehow this game received lower reviews than other games in the series, but to each their own. After this game, there was only one more added to the series, and that was Test Drive Ferrari Racing Legends, developed by Slightly Mad Studios and published by Rombax Games under a license from Atari. This game left the open world nature of the previous games and returned the series to a closed circuit racing style that was last used in Test Drive 6. The goal of the game was focused on Ferrari's history across racing. The game included Formula 1 and sports car racing. The game featured 50 different Ferraris. They each had their own very detailed interior and exterior. The game was released in celebration of the 65th anniversary of the first Ferrari ever built. The game looked great for the times, and overall the physics felt good, but I had never heard of this game until researching this video. It was released for PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and Windows. The game received okay reviews, and that's it. As of 2012, there were no more games added to the series. You may be asking, well, what happened? Earlier I mentioned that Infogrames was slowly rebranding to Atari, and this really didn't happen until around 2009 to about 2013. However, the company was still struggling with losses from the financial crisis in 2008, in return putting the entire company and its subsidiaries in an overall bad position. Atari SA filed for bankruptcy and sold off large amounts of its assets and businesses that it had acquired over the many years of business. Focusing mainly on the Test Drive series, it was sold to Big Ben Interactive, which was later renamed Nakon, which brings us to today. Excitingly, I left one more Test Drive off the list, Test Drive Unlimited Solar Crown, which is set to be released sometime this year. The developer's goal is to bring back some of the amazing gameplay that the original Test Drive Unlimiteds featured. The game is going to be based on a 1-to-1 scale of Hong Kong Island and features physics more on the simulation side of things. Nakon is working with KT Racing to make sure that what I thought was a distant dream of mine come true. KT Racing is the development studio behind the WRC series and has years of experience in building racing games. Because of this, I don't think that this is just going to be a remake of the originals, but rather a continuation of this influential series. I hope you enjoyed this video looking back on the Test Drive series, and also discovering what is to come. This video is longer than my normal content, but if you liked it, make sure to let me know in the comments section below. Also, if you're interested in learning more about the gaming industry, consider subscribing, as that's exactly what my channel covers. Thank you all so much for watching this video, and I will see you all next week.